Hello and welcome to a special edition we're calling The World This Year. I'm François Picard. Thanks for being with us. The World This Week throughout the year in partnership with the Daily Beast. We want to welcome Reem Momtaz, Paris correspondent for Politico.eu.
Yep. Thank you for having me.
Good year?
Good year. Very interesting year.
Very interesting year. Yeah. Lots to get to. Patrick Smith, editor-in-chief of the Africa Report.
Greetings, François.
Thanks for joining us. As well, we're with Richard Verly, Paris correspondent for Le Temps, the Swiss daily newspaper. How are you, sir?
Correct. I'm going as France. Bumpy sometimes.
It's been a little bumpy at times. Cracking the whip on the second floor of our building is France24.com senior editor Leila Jacinto. Welcome to the show. The World This Week on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag World This Week. Here in France, the year ended with strikes, unions leading organized mass demonstrations against pension reform. It started very differently. Every Saturday, leaderless yellow vests protests would descend on the capital, generally turning violent. Emmanuel Macron managed to outlast the movement with a mix of concessions and town hall-style meetings that proved a popular way to channel grievances. Of course, it was leaderless movements that caught on later in the year elsewhere. These images are from Santiago de Chile, and everywhere from Chile to Hong Kong, there was a mix of social and political grievances. Leila Jacinto, it's been the return of the leaderless movement, you might say, and in Hong Kong, we didn't think it would last this long.
You're absolutely right. I mean, if there has to be one defining moment of the or theme of this year, it was the year of the protest across the world, leaderless, but and different issues. But they all seem to be a sort of a fight for, I think, or a call for dignity. And in some respects, you know, we're ending this decade. We're entering into a new decade, and it seemed to be a version 2 of some of the lessons that were learned during the Arab Springs, especially in places like Algeria, Lebanon, where, you know, we saw the Arab Spring. The decade began in 2011 with the Arab Spring. And what happened was the Egyptian crackdown, really, where the military came back into power. And so we saw the protest movements in Sudan, as well as in Lebanon and Algeria, focused really on structural changes, not just the ousting of the big man.
Can we connect the dots on everything, or is each particular case different?
There are particularities, but I would say that if you had to connect the dots, it's a call for dignity. It's a call for social justice. In some places, like in Lebanon and in India, they are asking to overturn structural things that there were problems during the colonial era. With the yellow vests and Chile, they seem to be economic issues. In Hong Kong, it's also an extremely fundamental question of what was the system that the British left behind. 2 systems, 1 state. So I'd say they're asking for rights and for dignity.
Richard Verly, how do you explain this?
Well, I would personally be very careful at connecting the dots between Hong Kong, Chile, Algeria, and France. There is certainly a common aspect in protesting against more inequalities. And social justice is certainly a matter. But you do not compare the situation in Hong Kong, where you have the problem with China, with the government of China for the territory, and the problem in France, where the question is more how the government can respond to the call from several layers of people, especially this middle class, which feels endangered at the moment and in difficulty. So my answer to that would be I do not connect the dots. I think, for example, Algeria is a very, again, specific case with the end of the Bouteflika era, or the call for this era to end. But what we see is definitely people are not ready now to accept things as they are shown and put up to them by the respective government when the credibility of their government is under pressure.
All right, you talk about Algeria. We had leaderless movements bringing down not 1 but 2 longtime strongmen. News that the army-backed regime was still fronting Algeria's incapacitated 83-year-old president of 2 decades was too much. with the biggest demonstration since independence, chasing Abdelaziz Bouteflika from power.
I, the defense minister and head of the security committee, announce the uprooting of this regime and am arresting its head.
Announcement in Sudan. There they managed to topple another longtime president, Omar al-Bashir. Demonstrators braving bullets, managing to build enough of a civil society political opposition alliance to force the military to share power. There is a correlation, though, between what happened in Algeria and Sudan, Patrick Smith.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the conditions are similar. The aims of the protesters are to oust the military leader, or the military-backed leader, we should say, in the case of Algeria, and also the deteriorating economic conditions that's common to both. I think it ought to be said that the Sudanese have been spectacularly successful. The coalition between the grassroots resistance committees, the fact that they had this political organization right across the country. It wasn't just in the capital or even in Port Sudan, it was right across the country. And it was a coming together. Leila mentioned colonial grievances. A lot of the grievances in Sudan go back to the colonial era and the racism meted out by the centralized regime in Khartoum against the peoples in the hinterland. So all that came into play, and also the issue of women's rights. I mean, the strong participation of young, brave women in this uprising in Sudan was absolutely critical to changing the culture, the political culture, and also changing the aims of the revolution.
But the lesson from Egypt and Yemen and places like that in 2011, isn't it that it always ends badly?
If you want to be a glass half empty sort of person, yeah, there's huge risks. And of course, that was very much on the mind of the revolutionaries as they marched through Khartoum. I was there when Bashir was thrown out, and one of the placards read, "No to Cairo, no to Egypt, no to El-Sisi." They don't want a repeat of the Egyptian experience in which a new sort of Islamist formation comes to power, fails to get to grips with the economy, fails to make open political reforms, and then gets replaced by a military dictator. So there's an awareness they don't want the Islamists back, nor do they want hardline military rulers like Abdel Fattah el-Sisi either.
And the one good thing with the Sudan case was that the African Union really came up. The African Union was the one who, pushed it towards a transition when Sisi was very much opposed to it. So that's a very positive development.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's probably a rare plus for the African Union, and let's hope they can build on it. They do need now to appoint an envoy to then adjudicate the transition. I mean, we're still at the beginning, but I think you could say that 2019 has been a great success so far, but they've got another 2 years to go in this transition. A lot could happen then in Sudan.
All right, full disclosure, we've pre-recorded this show. We don't have the very latest on Lebanon and Iraq, where ordinary citizens rejected systems built on sectarian power sharing. What seemed like a good idea on paper turns out to mean unaccountability in two nations where people are fed up with mismanagement and corruption. Reem Mumtaz, the question about Sudan, will it end badly? You could ask as well about Lebanon.
You can ask that about Lebanon. I think Lebanon is, and I don't say this because I'm also Lebanese, but Lebanon is a bit of a special case because there's a level of, there can't be the kind of repression in Lebanon that we've seen in places like Cairo in 2011 or and even that we're seeing in Iraq today or in Iran today. The Lebanon stands on such a delicate balance that you can't actually be that sort of oppressive. It doesn't mean that the current revolution or the current protest movement is going to be able to...
You call it a revolution.
It is a very profound revolution in a very literal sense. It's a revolution because for the first time since modern Lebanon was built, the Lebanese are protesting not as Muslims, as Sunnis, as Maronites, as Christians. They are protesting as Lebanese, and they are asking for something which is a very sophisticated, actually, political demand. They are asking for a civil state. They want to be seen as citizens of a state and no longer as parts of a community that relies on, a traditional leader. What happens in Lebanon is going to be sort of very important because of, obviously, its position in the region when it comes to Syria, to Israel, to the Iran sort of arc of influence. What's happening in Iraq is slightly different. The setup in Iraq is different.
But it sounds familiar, doesn't it? You've got what the president has to be a Kurd, the speaker of parliament has to be a Sunni, the prime minister has to be a Shia.
Yes, but in Iraq, there is less of a need for consensus than has been established in Lebanon. In Lebanon, there's a bit more balance. There's a need to sort of maintain that balance. In Iraq today, they have a real problem, which is the complete sort of control that Iranian-backed politicians and militias exercise. In Lebanon, of course, Hezbollah has been the biggest impediment to getting out of the current deadlock. There is no question that they are the biggest sort of blocking power. But
just Hezbollah? I mean, Saad Hariri doesn't seem in a hurry to leave either. They seem to all like this kind of this setup.
Yes. I mean, all of the political leaders are not exactly thrilled with what the people in the streets are asking for. But in terms of getting out of the deadlock, in terms of moving forward, the former Prime Minister Hariri did resign at the very least, whereas the President Own, who is a very important ally of Hezbollah, has refused to move forward on any of the changes that have been demanded.
Richard Verly?
Well, two things. Coming back to the leaderless protest, I think undoubtedly 2019 has been the year of that type of protest, but it shows also the limit of being a leaderless movement. And in different countries we've mentioned, the fact that there was no leader at the end makes it maybe easier for the state to kind of stand by and wait.
Thus the fact that Sudan is the outlier? Because there is a leadership now.
Well, I do think there are differences, but again, what we thought was a great idea of protesting without leader, and that is coming from, let's say, the bottom, becomes a problem when we talk about possible alternative.
Well, they have to break cover at some point. The people that are trying to organize the opposition have to come out and present a political leadership. And the reason, say, in Sudan and to some extent in Algeria, they didn't want to, was because once you get into partisan politics, then it's much easier for the incumbent military rulers or their proxies to divide up the opposition. So I think
this is.
But you take Richard's point, though, that at some point,
Yes.
you need leadership.
So there's two sides to this. One, the reason why these protesters don't want a leader is because they've learned the lessons of the counter-revolution of Cairo in 2011. And they have internalized that because, as you say, it's much easier once you have a leader, much easier for the established regime, the system in place, to take them down. We're seeing that in Lebanon. There's an internal conversation among those who are protesting. Some say it's now time to organize politically because we need to push things forward. But we're also seeing a very specific case. There is one name that's been circulating as a possible sort of prime minister, transitional prime minister in Lebanon, Nawaf Salam. And he suddenly is now being attacked on social media in a completely gratuitous way. People are making up fake news about him, even though he is someone who isn't even... so he's someone who is really above and beyond any kind of reproach. So this is the issue that we are now facing.
It's about leaderless movements, but it's also about, proxies losing their luster. And in the case of both Lebanon and Iraq, Iran, to a lesser degree the United States, but mostly Iran, have a big problem.
I was just going to say that Iran and the nexus of Iran-Russia came under real pressure this time. So in Africa, it was sort of the counter-revolutionaries. Sisi turned into the enemy that the protesters had to watch for. But the Iranian influence, particularly in Lebanon and in Iraq, so Iran is going into the next year in a particularly vulnerable state. We will really have to see what would be the Iranian response to it. But certainly, there were extraordinary scenes in Iraq with Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani. This is a Shiite cleric who has stayed apolitical, coming out in support of the protesters. And it's also marked in Lebanon and in Iraq, these confessional systems that were imposed by Europeans. And, the rallying cry seems to be united. The problem is in Lebanon, they are extremely entrenched political power bodies, unlike in Sudan, where we had the Professionals Association, and those lines were clearer. In Lebanon, but on the other hand, Lebanon really has the expertise to see this through. What it really now needs to see is whether the vested political interests can really stop fundamental change.
So there's one nuance point, I think, between Iraq and Lebanon in terms of the positioning toward Iran. In Iraq, it was much more explicit. There were attacks against Iranian consulates, which we've never seen before. In Lebanon, the protesters are not marching or protesting against or chanting against Iran. It's been very sophisticated the way they've decided to do it. They've decided to say, we are chanting against the entire system, every single one of the politicians.
And what's that rallying cry again in Arabic?
كلٌ يعني كلٌ.
Which means?
All of them means everyone. And it's a very important thing because actually it's, in a way, it's disarmed the system because it's not, no one can say, well, it's, which is the usual trope in Lebanon, of course, that it's, let's say the Americans trying to weaken, the resistance or Israel, when the people are saying, we actually don't want everyone, whether it's the, Hariri or Hon or Hezbollah, no one can say it's being, used against anyone in particular.
And how does the West react to that change? We'll talk about it when we come back. You're watching The World This Year on France 24. Welcome back to a special edition we're calling The World This Year. The World This Week is all year long in partnership with The Daily Beast. We're joined by Rim Momtaz, Paris correspondent for Politico. Welcome back as well to Patrick Smith, editor-in-chief of the Africa Report. Richard Verly, Paris correspondent for Le Temps, the Swiss daily newspaper. And France24.com's very own Leila Jacinto. Just before the break, we were discussing how Iran's been weakened by all those leaderless protests in the region. Weakened Iran, strengthened Turkey. It was a triumphant Recep Tayyip Erdogan who was welcomed to the White House in November, 2 weeks before a NATO summit in London. Donald Trump had gifted him a partial withdrawal from Syria, enabling Erdogan to intervene and take on the Kurds there who'd been fighting ISIS, the same Turks who had just bought Russian anti-aircraft missiles, prompting the leader of a fellow NATO member, France, to deem the alliance brain dead in an interview with The Economist. Of course, try telling that to Erdogan.
I am speaking from Turkey to French President Emmanuel Macron, and I will tell him when we meet at the NATO summit. First, get your own brain death checked out.
Of course, they did meet, Leila Jacinto. I don't know if he said that to him in person or not, but it's been, we can safely say, a bad 2019 for NATO.
Yeah, but this was going to happen because within NATO we've got the only NATO member which is a Muslim majority country. In Syria we had the US-led coalition, fighting in conjunction with the Kurds that Turkey considers its mortal enemy. Coming to the brain dead, which Reem is probably going to speak more. I mean, Macron was actually issuing a sort of a cry that something needs to shake up in NATO. But with the fundamental problem with Syria and with Turkey is that we have not been able to open up the issue of Turkish peace negotiations with the Kurds. And so we have within the NATO alliance a member state that has rejected any sort of peace negotiations, and the entire bloc is now being held hostage to this. And now, I mean, I really think that NATO, frankly, will tide this over. You know, NATO as an organization, you know, they don't have any mechanisms, an exit. So they will just lay low and hopefully, as always, hope that there's going to be a leadership change and there won't be any fundamental change. Because there are many people, especially in Germany, who would actually like to see Turkey leave NATO. But I don't think that's happening anytime soon.
Shafadi, you agree that this will all pass? This will blow over?
Well, probably because NATO remains the strongest military alliance in the world, and for many members, especially in Europe, it is seen as an insurance policy backed by the United States. And that's how these governments see NATO, and they want to keep at the moment this insurance policy. The question for NATO is more whether the alliance accepts to engage into different fronts or simply remaining an alliance to keep Europe safe. And I think that was the subject at the London summit. Again, for many heads of states and government in Europe, the most important thing is for the American insurance policy to remain in place at whatever cost, because we know now that Donald Trump wants everybody to pay more for that insurance policy. Only Emmanuel Macron came in with the need for a strategic reflection, a strategic kind of debate. He managed to get one small article in the final declaration, but to me, I was in London at the summit. What was striking is that nobody, absolutely nobody, came in the rescue to Macron. So indeed,
why is that?
Because they don't want that strategic debate to take place. For them, the American insurance policy is enough. It's already very shaky with Trump. They don't want to shake it more. And that's the strength of Erdogan. Erdogan knows that. Certainly, he is himself isolated within NATO. But for many allies, Erdogan is a problem that can be managed while nobody really wants to shake the alliance as it is.
Is this a problem of Turkey, or is it a problem of the United States?
Well, I think the first thing to say about Turkey is that Erdogan has had an incredibly good year. He's faced down Trump. He's made Trump do a U-turn. He's kind of ridiculed him publicly. I think when Trump wrote a rather histrionic letter to Erdogan, Erdogan publicly threw it in the dustbin and proceeded, as we could see, send his troops into Syria as he's threatening to, and as Trump told him not to go easy on. Erdogan has also faced down Vladimir Putin, and still at home, despite the appearance of new opposition formations and some of his old allies jumping ship, he's still in an incredibly strong position. He doesn't face an election until 2023. So I think it's his year. But I think the dilemma... Even
though he lost those municipal elections in Istanbul.
Yeah, right. He's lost those, and definitely the new mayor of Istanbul is a potent new political force. But unless Erdogan calls an election, he's there for the next 3-4 years, yeah? So I think that's an important fact. So he's been able to impose his ideas on NATO. He's also procured Russian military equipment, contrary to the spirit of NATO, if not the law, the rules of NATO. But I think he points to a bigger strategic problem. His spat with Macron then inspired Macron to say, well, what on earth is this alliance about? How are we going to relate to Russia? And I don't think that's at all clear. It's not clear whether Russia is a strategic enemy or just a country that's on the borders of NATO, and how NATO relates to Ukraine, what it does for Ukraine. Will that policy then sort of go out into the twilight with Angela Merkel? Because it was Angela Merkel who promoted that pro-Ukraine, defend Ukraine policy against Russia, imposing the sanctions and all the rest of it. And there's a sense that the rest of the members of NATO are far less enthused about Merkel's stance vis-à-vis Ukraine and Russia. So I think Macron's absolutely right. Those big strategic questions have to be answered. And trying to sweep them under the carpet isn't the way forward.
Correct, he's right, but he's alone.
Sure, but a lot of people must be agreeing with him privately. They just don't have the guts to come out and say it.
So I think there are a few things that this debate has revealed. One, people who were part of, let's say, the Western world think we're laying down all of our differences in broad daylight. How does Russia think about this? Putin must be laughing in his, in the Kremlin. That also kind of makes it seem like, for example, the Russian-Iranian pseudo-alliance, because it's not exactly an alliance, has no issues whatsoever. They have issues, even, in the Astana 3, when we're talking about Syria, Turkey, Iran, and Russia, there are real problems among them, but they don't debate things publicly the way the West does. So in a way, perhaps it's better to have some of these conversations publicly. On what Emmanuel Macron did, he perhaps started out alone, very alone, when he gave that interview that really made a lot of waves and upset many, many people among his allies. But actually, in private, a lot of the allies do agree that there is a need to sort of rethink certain things. They're just not happy with the way he did it. And he kind of shot himself in the foot.
Did he shoot himself in the foot?
He shot himself in the foot with his method, even though French diplomacy is extremely agile and was able to do some very good damage control after that interview. And by the time they got to the NATO summit in London, he had recovered quite well. What I heard is that that meeting with Erdogan, Johnson, and Merkel and Macron went actually well. It wasn't as acrimonious as one could have thought it might have been after Erdogan's pretty disrespectful comments about Macron. Let's not forget that Macron never attacked anyone personally. He talked about the alliance and the need to rethink certain things. And also what Macron understood, and what was the bigger issue with the Economist interview, is how things were perceived among Eastern European countries, which really for them, the alliance and the American security guarantee is an existential one. And that is something that perhaps France hasn't shown enough consideration for. But this time around, Macron went around personally to each one of the Eastern European leaders, had a conversation with them, and the French diplomatic...
But was that more to reassure them, since he had welcomed Vladimir Putin to the French president's country house?
Yes. And so that is the other side of why his comments to The Economist were so controversial, because they come on the backdrop of his very public desire to open up a détente and a rapprochement with Russia, which makes a lot of the Eastern Europeans nervous, but also Germany, but also the UK, for very concrete reasons. Putin's Russia is not exactly being very docile toward Europe. It continues its attacks, whether it's, actual military attacks on European soil or cyber attacks. And that is something that Macron is still having a hard time explaining and justifying to his allies.
Richard Vardy, final point on this. We have seen towards the end of the year a little bit of an easing in the eastern part of Ukraine. We had a sit-down in Paris between the leaders of Ukraine, France, Germany, and Russia. Do you get the sense that Macron's strategy has worked, or it's just, piecemeal for now?
Well, I must say I admire Reem's defense of the Macron narrative. I'm not so sure Macron was as successful as you said, Reem.
I just have to say, I'm not defending his narrative. I'm kind of just relating how things were said to me from, by the way, sources in different countries around the alliance.
It's very French, this idea that Macron has put forward some ideas and that everybody is catching the idea, despite the fact that they do not admit publicly. But sorry to say, when you are in an alliance, what counts is what you say publicly.
Yes.
Is the statement you make publicly. Whatever you say inside the room does not count. And Donald Trump knows it perfectly. Coming back to Russia, I think Patrick was right. 2019 was probably Erdogan years. We'll see 2020, will it be Putin year? Will Putin manage to continue to push his domino in Europe, or will finally the allies find a way to address him? Macron's strategy at the moment is to say, we shall engage Putin. We can't only try to pull Putin back because it does not work. So we'll see whether France has something to propose and whether France again, and I'm turning here to Germany and to others, manage to convince its allies that it's time for a reset towards Putin.
But also whether Putin actually shows any real desire to engage constructively with this approach, which to this day we have not seen in concrete terms.
And the person that's most capable of doing that would be Angela Merkel, who is due to leave the scene in 2021. I mean,
But that's and that's the other.
I think that's what Putin has in mind, as you said, when he surveys Europe and the NATO alliance more widely. That's what he sees. He sees a bunch of politicians on their way out, or in the case of Trump and Macron, pretty ambivalent about the future.
And the German positioning is quite problematic for the future of the Western Bloc. Germany needs to sort of live up to better strategic positioning, to sort of embrace the role of a power more than it has so far.
Definitely one for a conversation when we discuss the world next year. 2019, by the way, was the year the world's largest democracy re-elected Narendra Modi. Voters giving the leader of India's Hindu nationalist BJP party the largest majority of any Indian leader in decades. In his first term, you'll remember Modi promised to put toilets before temples. That's to say, work on development before ideology. But a February suicide attack targeting Indian security in disputed Kashmir changed the tone. After that, it was identity politics all the way, with Parliament since his re-election approving the Citizenship Amendment Act, which offers a path to citizenship for immigrants from neighboring states, so long as they're not Muslim. Back in April, this is how the president of Modi's party, who, by the way, is now the interior minister, described illegal Muslim migrants from neighboring Bangladesh while on the campaign trail.
These infiltrators are like termites on the land of Bengal. They are a threat to the security of the nation, and they are snatching away the livelihoods of our poor people. The BJP is determined to throw these infiltrators out, and we will surely do it.
And that was back in April, Leila Jacinto. We've seen what's happened since.
2019 has been an absolutely incredible year for the world's largest democracy. I think the international community is finally waking up to what has been happening there. It's a slow process, but it's spilled over. So in 1 year, you saw Narendra Modi win in a landslide, a re-election in a landslide. But the year is ending with unprecedented protests. And these are protests where even the Muslim community that has so far kept quiet under this complete battering of their rights, which has been a very slow process, coming out onto the streets. And in the last 5 months, literally, the country has seen radical changes. The first was change was the change in the status of Kashmir. This is a disputed territory. This is something that's very fundamental to the birth of India. Kashmir lost its special status. Then, months later, there was a ruling by the Supreme Court on this very controversial site that is disputed by Muslims and Hindus. The Supreme Court came in favor of the Hindus. So that was also a mark of how exactly is the judiciary working. And finally, the Citizenship Amendment Bill, which has brought people on the streets. And the reason why this is done, because everybody talks about CAB. In India, they love acronyms. The Citizen Amendment Bill, which is now an act, it has been passed. The reason why this has really disturbed people is because what has been happening away from that is a national registration of citizenships, which happened in the
NRC.
The NRC, which happened in Assam. And what these registrations and these lists are really lists of exclusion. So the registration in this one state of Assam came up with nearly 2 million people who have doubtful citizenship. And so these people have to prove their citizenship. And this includes people, relatives of the former president of India, former army people, decorated police officers, all of them Muslims. So the message is
But there were also non-Muslims who were struck from the list. It wasn't just Muslims.
Yes, there were non-Muslims. And when when these results came up, the government introduced a citizenship amendment bill. So many people who are afraid see this as a way of correcting what the registration
is the India of Gandhi and Nehru, based on the secular principles, was that a parenthesis? And that, well, because some are saying India was Hindu nationalist before, and it's just reverting back to its state now.
India was never Hindu nationalist. The Hindu nationalists really started in the 1990s or late 1980s. But no, what they have done is a reversal of Nehru and Gandhi's India, which is a real loss for the international community, because India was a beacon for the sort of post-colonial world, and now it is going along these sectarian lines, and the secular nature of the republic is being battered. I'm not sure, the next year will show if there will be any resistance to this. But really, if you ask me this question in October or November, I would have said, secular democracy as it was in India died.
Died?
Yeah.
Wow. Well, Patrick Smith, we've seen, it's not just India, by the way. We saw Aung San Suu Kyi before the International Criminal Court defending Myanmar against charges of genocide against its Rohingya minority. We saw a hardline Sinhalese elected president in Sri Lanka. We've seen that there are Islamist parties putting a lot of pressure in both Bangladesh and Pakistan. This sort of identity politics, it's a mix of nationalism and religion. It's not just India.
No, it's absolutely toxic, and it's going to affect the stability. It's going to affect the development agenda. And I think one of the vulnerabilities of someone like Modi, having played the nationalist Hindu card so strongly, is he going to be able to deliver on the other things? Because people say, well, okay, you've done that. We've had this law. If I'm a hardline nationalist and discriminating against Muslims, that's not a problem for some of his followers. But the problem is now the economic delivery, and that seems to be slowing. There's increasing criticism of the cronyism around the Gujarat entrepreneurs, the Gujarat oligarchs, as they're known in India. So I think the problems are just starting. Yes, he's won this fantastic re-election, but the problems with the mission, if you like, are now becoming economic and developmental, as well as this youthful revolt that we've seen in the closing weeks of 2019. Which is it's certainly not a Muslim movement. It's a pan-Indian movement. It's Hindus, it's Sikhs, it's Muslims, it's everyone. Young, dynamic people taking to the streets and protesting against this sort of identity politics and getting pushed down by the.
Okay, so speaking of young people, soundbite of the year undoubtedly goes to the 16-year-old from Stockholm who made world leaders squirm at a UN climate summit in New York back in September.
This is all wrong. I shouldn't be up here. I should be back in school on the other side of the ocean. Yet you all come to us young people for hope. How dare you? You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words. And yet I'm one of the lucky ones.
Richard Verly, that soundbite has been repeated over again. It still gives people chills, though, when they watch it.
Well, I remember I was here in your program once and you asked us about Greta Thunberg. Personally, I did not like her speech at the UN, this speech. I saw that when she came to France, she was invited by the National Assembly. She was really doing well. She had two scientists by her side, and whatever she said was mainly to say we need more awareness, and she was turning to the scientists for more explanation. Here at the UN, she took a very personal approach toward world's leader, because the audience in front of her was made of heads of states and government. And I think in a bit she stepped the line. She went too far.
She tempered her speech at the end of the year when she spoke before the UN climate summit in
I know
Madrid.
Time decided that she is the person of the year. It's probably true by the media effect, the media impact of Greta Thunberg. But frankly speaking, if you look at what she achieved, and if that should be the measure, she's certainly not the woman of the year.
Not the woman of the year?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, in a way, perhaps she gets credit for making the conversation about climate change, for focusing it a bit more, for giving it a bit more media attention. And perhaps we should think as journalists, why is it that we do not cover issues of climate change? Why is it that every day, in every one of our news bulletins, we do not talk about one way or another that we are already seeing the catastrophic effects of climate change? Why do we have to latch on to a young girl who's doing as well as she can, I'm sure, who is 16? Why do we have to have her sort of carry that burden? But I do agree that speech I was in that room, I was at the UNGA when she was giving that speech, and it was really over the top, and it just felt very contrived from my standpoint.
Felt contrived?
Yes.
Wow. Patrick Smith?
Well, I think the importance of what she's doing is it's a generational issue. And if you read some of these books that are looking at the next 20, 30 years, she's absolutely right as a teenager to draw attention to it. And I think her points are absolutely right. Sure, you can quibble about the expression and the finesse, but, you know, she is a teenager and she's starting a political career. Presumably it's going to go from strength to strength. But I think on the generational issue, it's the boomer syndrome. The boomers have stolen, she's right, they've stolen the future. They've messed up the environment. And I think the anger of the people in their teens and 20s is palpable and entirely justified.
Entirely justified. So let's go around the room then and say, who is the person of the year? Who's your person of the year, Leila Jacinta?
I have a gender, and not an agenda. My person of the year is the female protester, it begins with Sudan with Ala Salah. My person of the year is Kandaka, which is female power, because we saw in Sudan this incredible architecture student. She stood, she became iconic. She stood on a car with a traditional outfit with sneakers. So it was not just a statement of gender power, but it was also cultural. She was over there. They were talking about an Islamist dictator, and she was asserting cultural pride. We saw in India this month, we saw female protesters protecting their male colleagues. These are female students from being beaten up by the police.
Protester it is, and you two put Sudan in your list.
I have to say, I think Ala Salah was absolutely emblematic of the spirit of that revolution. You've really got to look at the details on the ground. It was like it was Woodstock meets storming of the Winter Palace. You had 500,000 Sudanese organizing a sit-in outside the defense headquarters, which had been in power, the military had been in power for 30 years. They'd killed over 2 million people, if you count the war in South Sudan and the attacks in Darfur. So, these people had courage and they were doing something really new and brave.
Richard Verly, your person of the year.
Well, sorry, I'll come back to France, as I am correspondent in France, and I would mention Laurent Berger, the trade union leader from CFDT, because he's the one who's really trying to reconcile social needs and need for reform. And in France, that's quite unique. So at the moment, I believe he's holding the title for French for Person of the Year 2019.
Reem Momtaz.
So my heart thinks that it's the Lebanese protester, but for all the reasons we mentioned before. But for me, it's Boris Johnson.
Oh.
And I never thought I would say this until this election that just happened a few weeks ago. Honestly, he is, in a way, it's interesting, Boris Johnson. He came out, everyone sort of thought he was a buffoon. No one was taking him seriously. No one thought he could deliver. In fact, he's been able to deliver on everything he came out saying he was going to do.
And we'll be talking about it
in
the world when we look at the world in 2020 for another special edition. I hope you'll be joining us. I know you will. Stay with us. Thanks for joining us for this special edition. And a happy end of the year, as we say here in France.